True to its name, the fighting type is renowned as having many of the best offensive Pokemon in the game. However, this wasn't always the case. Originally, fighters were not only not great, but outright abysmal. How did we get to the modern day where fighters effortlessly, spectacularly crush nearly all in their path with such regularity, and have done so for longer than much of the current player base will remember? We're going to track fighters from their lowly, more specific origins, explaining the details of their strengths, since they weren't always the instant smashing machines we know them as now. This video's long, so this intro will be short. Today, we're exploring when the fighting type was terrible and how it was saved. But before we start, bundle up with this video sponsor, MeUndies. Guys, winter is coming, and not only do you need gifts, but you also need to stay warm. Luckily for us, MeUndies has you covered on both. MeUndies is the best choice for comfort because of their micromodal fabric, especially the ball caddy. If you never thought you needed a special pouch for your parts to keep them separate, take the hundreds of 5-star reviews as your sign that this could be your new favorite boxer brief. Some of them even have a contoured pouch to make you look bigger if you catch my drift. The most comfortable underwear in the world comes in a variety of prints. I really like the desert sky and turtly awesome print that I have. These designs are really nice and remind me to stay cozy as I sleep in them. There's over 10 different styles of undies ranging from boxer briefs to jock straps, and there are over 100 different colors and prints. Pick one that you like and you won't be disappointed. And of course, MeUndies is so confident that if you don't like your first pair of undies, then it's on MeUndies, free of charge. Winter is coming, so get some warm clothing and go to MeUndies.com/FSG and use promo code FSG for 20% off your first order plus free shipping. And thank you so much to MeUndies for sponsoring this video. The fighting type's debut was also its lowest point, and make no mistake, it plundered the most desolate depths of non-viability. It wasn't obviously terrible though, to those of us accustomed to fighting's long-standing reputation of excellence. Insofar as it consistently demolishes tier staples, Gen 1 might not seem that different in this regard. In fact, everyone who gets into Gen 1 at one point or another has a moment where they get the idea to use a fighting type, so they can super effectively threaten the dominant normal trio of Tauros, Snorlax, and Chansey that otherwise lacks weaknesses. Yes, Psychics are also dominant here, but surely the rewards are worthwhile. After all, other Psychics also have to contend with Psychics. Gengar and Victreebel are Psychic weak and are useful Pokemon. Plus, it's not just any old fighting type. The theoretical anti-metagame force in question is none other than the mighty Machamp, renowned destroyer of many a generation. How could it ever have been bad? It wasn't only the strongest fighter by far, but also tied with Kingler and OU mainstay Rhydon for the highest attack stat in the game of anything not named Dragonite, meaning it also had the benefit of wielding a particularly impressive Hyper Beam. And unlike Dragonite and Kingler, Machamp, like Rhydon, had actual useful physical stab to use. Speaking of Rhydon, that was another OU staple Machamp's fighting stab struck super effectively. Plus, its HP and defense made it decently tanky on the physical side, and while it was far from fast, it also had the same speed stat as the meta-defining Exeggutor, so that wouldn't be a problem, especially with how much of Gen 1 already revolved around paralysis. With all this in mind, Machamp seemed primed for, if not a revolutionary crusher of metagame staples, at least some sort of niche. Everyone who has this idea to try Machamp immediately congratulates themselves on it. It just seems so perfect, and then wonders why nobody else has used it. I must just be a particularly special type of Pokemon master, they think to themselves. However, when they actually try out Machamp, they immediately realize there is a very good reason why Machamp's complete lack of usage in serious Gen 1 play. It is terrible. They then realize that they are far from the first person to have gone through this cycle. Indeed, Machamp has been tried by enterprising Gen 1ers for decades, and each and every time, the results came back equally dismally. Let's start with the stab move it wants to use to dish out its fighting type pain, Submission. It clocks in at a perfectly solid 80 base power. That's almost as much as Body Slam's 85, and since it's coming off of a much higher attack stat, it's going to be out-damaging the main tool used by Snorlax and Tauros, so power-wise, all is well. Where the problem begins is the recoil incurred with each hit. Inflicting 25% of damage dealt back on Machamp is not nearly strong or spammable enough to justify such a massive drawback, nor do leftovers exist to offset the issue. Instead, you just make it easier to be revenge killed. That's not all either. Submission's accuracy isn't just imperfect, it's 80%, bringing with it the same shade of inconsistency and frustration that so plagues users of Hydro Pump and Stone Edge in later generations. So you're often missing, and when you're not missing, you're damaging yourself. Another issue, Machamp's defensive presence is next to none. It can't switch into anything safely. It has to enter in against resting Snorlax or Chansey using Soft Boiled. It doesn't take any damage well, its defensive consistency already spotty to begin with, and doesn't appreciate being even easier to pick off for the Tauros it's supposed to be threatening. It definitely can't afford to take paralysis either, unlike Exeggutor, whose Psychic and Explosion are always reliable, and whose typing and bulk are much better for taking hits. Machamp's already inaccurate submission becomes even more unreliable, and its lower bulk and lack of resistances becomes even easier to take advantage of when it's not outrunning Snorlax and Rhydon. That's not even getting into the Psychic issue. Machamp's Body Slam, Earthquake, and Hyper Beam are quite decent, but it needs to be more than decent given how it has a limited window of opportunity. If you're not hitting the field consistently, you have to get a lot of damage done in a short period of time, and Machamp fails to do that without both great play and great fortune. Having issues with Psychics isn't necessarily a deal breaker in Gen 1, but you better be bringing something seriously game-breaking to the table to justify it. Think Gengar's Hypnosis, Normal Immunity, and Fast Explosion, or Victory Bell Sleep Powder, Auto Crit Razor Leaf, and arguably ban-worthy Wrap. Machamp has no such bars it can drop, just the ability to slug it out with raw power. And that power isn't even close to being sufficient to justify these flaws. Consider this, Submission only 2-hit KOs Rhydon about 1/4 of the time and maxes out at 60% against Snorlax. These are impressive figures in and of themselves, but not when taken in consideration with Machamp's many damning flaws. Some players have tried to get around this issue with Low Kick, which has a flat 50 base power in Gen 1, but also has a 30% flinch rate, which means it can potentially luck its way past slower targets, especially in conjunction with paralysis. But this is spectacularly unreliable, and if you thought Submission's power was disappointing, just wait until you see Low Kick that isn't even a guaranteed 3-hit KO against Snorlax and fails to 2-hit KO Tauros. That is the flaw of the fighting type in Gen 1. It's not just that it's Psychic weak in a Psychic world, it's that the resists are few and useless, the users are frail, and they can't even do damage to make up for it. Machamp is the strongest fighter, and it doesn't just fail to hack it in OU, it has the same issue in UU and even NU. The other fighters, Primeape, Hitmonlee, and Hitmonchan, are even worse, meaning they are completely useless. The best fighter in the game is actually Poliwrath, which is an actual NU Pokemon, even though its stats aren't the most amazing. And you know why that is? Because its strengths don't center around it being a fighting type. It almost doesn't utilize its fighting typing at all, since Submission is an option, but one you would rather avoid if you can help it, given its many flaws, and Poliwrath often can help it. In fact, it would be much better if it wasn't a fighting type, and was able to rid itself of its Psychic weakness. Its strength comes from the fact that it's a water type and has access to the doubled Calm Mind that is Gen 1 Amnesia, as well as being able to dish out Sleep with Hypnosis. These are game-breaking moves. Its best fighting move is actually Counter, and if we're going that route, then the best fighting type in Gen 1 is actually Chansey, which wields an absolutely wicked counter. That's how you can look at fighters in Gen 1. The best fighter is a water type that wishes its fighting type wouldn't drag it down, and the best use of a fighting move is on a normal Pokemon with the lowest attack in the game. Fighters improved leaps and bounds in Gen 2, but this wasn't saying much in the grand scheme of things, given how bottom of the barrel they were before. Still, they were, at the very least, not complete junk anymore. The reigning fighter from Gen 1, Poliwrath, improved in the sense that even though it lost Amnesia's ability to boost special attack, it was still too much for NU and got banned. Though again, its fighting typing played a relatively minimal role here, as it mainly ran Rest Talk sets, whose fighting moves was, Seismic Toss, another fighting move that would become most famous for being wielded by Chansey and Blissey. Poliwrath's fighting stab upgrade over Submission was the famously unreliable Dynamic Punch, another move notably used by non-fighting types for its confusion potential in Gen 2. Poliwrath itself would only use the move when wielded by Cianwood Gym Leader Chuck. It also received Lovely Kiss and Belly Drum, which were game-breaking moves, but also not really representative of fighters in general, and risky, thus rarely used relative to the incredibly reliable Rest Talker. Meanwhile, the Hitmons, now joined by Hitmontop, now had much better fighting stab, foregoing Submission in favor of High Jump Kick, coming in at 85 base power and 90 accuracy. It did have recoil, but only if the move failed via missing, protect, hitting a ghost, or that fainted upon switching in, and its recoil was a paltry 1/8 of what it would have dealt. Primeape got an even better fighting buff in the form of Stab Cross Chop, which was just as strong as Dynamic Punch, but with 80% accuracy instead of 50%. Not that this accuracy isn't frustrating, but it's much more palatable when it's not dealing recoil on each hit like Submission did. and it's much stronger than submission to boot. Additionally, it didn't have dynamic punches confusion, but it did pack a potentially devastating high critical hit rate. All these fighters also enjoyed the massive boost to their move pools that was Hidden Power, which at the time was not an all special move as it would become in Gen 4 onward, but physical or special based on the type chart at the time. This allowed them to run HP Bug to super effectively smack Psychics. If Ghost were a concern, they could go with HP Ghost, though Bug was preferable if you could help it because it lowered your IVs, which were then called DVs. In this vein, the addition of Pursuit was also a huge boon to fighters, being able to effectively trap these counters to their stab, which allowed the fighters themselves to run more generally threatening movesets. Finally, fighters loved the addition of universal physical boosting in Curse, whose speed drop wasn't great, but whose boost to attack and defense was invaluable in letting them actually muscle through targets with their fighting stab. Another major fighting type addition was Heracross, but it wasn't much of a fighting type insofar as its most reliable fighting move was, once again, Seismic Toss. Its other fighting stab was the tremendously unreliable Reversal, and thus Heracross's offensive output was largely defined by its monstrously powerful bug stab, Mega Horn. Its fighting typing was mostly nice in that it made it neutral to Rock Slide. Its Dark Resist didn't do much here. Heracross was a good OU Pokemon for its defensive utility first and foremost, standing in the way of threats like Nidoking, Marowak, and Machamp. Yes, Machamp was the pinnacle of Gen 2's fighting threat, the first instance of its renown for OU destruction. Take all of these fighting buffs and apply them to Machamp. Cross Chop as stab, it can now pose a serious offensive threat, especially since Psychics had generally taken a hit thanks to the Dark and Steel types that Machamp also handily crushed. Indeed, their great prominence across the generations is one of the great strengths of the fighting type. Steels are especially popular, often being stacked on teams, and Dark types are synonymous with the most popular Pokemon across the gens, Tyranitar, who is also of course a pursuiter that supports the fighter so well. Even going back to Gen 2, removing Exeggutor means Machamp doesn't need to run HP Bug, for example. Plus, even the fighting neutral Steels, particularly Skarmory but also Fortress, do not take too kindly to neutral fighting stabs given their power, in broader terms anyway. In Gen 2, it's not quite so easy still. Of course, the biggest note about Gen 2 Machamp is that its Cross Chop is by far the strongest non-explosion move against King Snorlax. Machamp's lack of normal resist or significant physical bulk means it can't actually switch into Snorlax though, even with the maxed out EV system. However, being able to so singularly threaten the otherwise difficult to scratch Snorlax is such a unique, important role that it means Machamp will always be able to threaten, especially considering how many fighting weaks Lax is often paired with. In addition to the aforementioned Dark and Steel types, there's also Cloyster. The maxed out EV system also means that Skarmory, at higher base speed, is faster than Machamp, which can be troublesome for its faster Drill Pecks, especially since even a boosted Machamp isn't exactly threatening to drop it, and since Skarm can curse first and match Machamp's boost to neutralize the effect. However, with paralysis support from common teammates like Stunspore Exeggutor and Body Slam Snorlax, Machamp can overcome this issue. Sometimes it even likes Fire Blast to threaten Skarmory without having to commit a turn to boosting, as well as immediately threaten the one-hit KO on Fortress, preventing Rapid Spin from the crucial spikes that Machamp enjoys so much for the extra chip damage on non-flying types. Indeed, as strong as Machamp is now, it still needs support. Things like spikes and Toxic on Cloyster to poison the otherwise irritating Starmie are quite standard to be fair, but Pursuit and Paralysis are more specific, though hardly going out of one's way. Furthermore, it doesn't just need support, but careful play as well to actually get the most out of its destructive potential. Machamp also needs a skilled trainer to get it on the field safely, something it struggles with. Yes, it has received a nice new special defense stat in Gen 2, but it still doesn't have much in the way of safe switching opportunities due to a lack of useful resists. Its favorite entry point is Tyranitar, but even that isn't exactly scot-free. Earthquake with Spikes Up will sting quite a bit, especially since Machamp, for all its power, is far from guaranteed to immediately make the most of that switch-in to force progress on the opponent. Spikes in general tends to exacerbate this quite a bit, even against light hits like Tyranitar's Crunch or Rock Slide, and this wrench thrown in survivability gives it the tendency to get pivoted around by Zapdos, making paralysis support even more desirable. Trainers also have to exert particular caution around Cross Chop, whose 8 PP can run out quite quickly in GSC's Wars of Attrition. They really have to use the threat of them early on to make sure when they need to land those hits that really count, they have enough left to actually do so. They also need an eye on the damage calculator to make sure their eyes aren't bigger than their stomach. Otherwise, they might think Machamp hits harder than its impressive attacking profile would suggest. For instance, despite hitting super effectively, a +1 Cross Chop will never one-hit KO a full health Cloyster. The progression of fighters in Gen 2 is thus that they now actually have stabs for their impressive attack stats to use, as well as auxiliary tools to help get around anti-fighting tactics. However, fighters are still generally not great at getting on the field and need support to make sure their hits land with the precision required for the impact they would like. Gen 3 is where fighting began developing its reputation as an offensive powerhouse typing. It was now more than just Machamp, as it had been in Gen 2, since Heracross didn't really count as a fighter back then. However, for a long time, fighters were overlooked in OU because they were just so useless defensively, and even in the faster pace of Advance, some defensive value was still important for each team slot, since even the hardest hitters had natural, good checks. They weren't so destructive where you could easily justify their lack of contribution to a team's defensive integrity. Despite their power, they weren't so automatic in dropping everything with it, and they weren't very fast either. Sure, they boasted the ability to destroy Tier King Tyranitar, but Tyranitar's Sand ensured that these big guns were on a fast timing timer that it and its crew would exploit to the fullest. Even if you did manage to get the slugger of yours onto the field safely against Tyranitar, Blissey, Snorlax, or Regice, not the easiest task for that matter, then you'd likely get played around by some combination of OU Titans such as Gengar, Salamence, Zapdos, Celebi, Jirachi, Metagross, Claydol, Dugtrio, Aerodactyl, and of course not just Sand, but its good friend Spikes. Over time though, fighters became more appreciated for their ability to reliably crush common defensive cores, making them strong anti-metagame choices. But time past Zapdos functioning like a U-turn Pokemon in later generations became the quick and easy solution to get just about every big hitter on the field, and fighters partnered with it beautifully given how completely they destroy its slow, especially defensive answers. Powerful Fighting Stab is unique in the enormous damage it threatens against them, as in addition to threatening Blissey and Tyranitar most notably, the fighters were appreciated for packing Stab that wasn't resisted by their eternal partners Skarmory and Swampert. Plenty of pokes could threaten Bliss and Tar, but to do so without being stopped by Skarmory and Pert was incredible. They didn't automatically destroy them of course, but you couldn't exactly rely on them to stomach Stab focus punches. Basically, they were physical attackers that weren't stopped by the tier's most common physical walls. This extended to bulky Flygon and other waters like Milotic and Suicune too. Additionally, though the tier was not short on fighting resist, these fighting resists were not necessarily sufficient to stop the fighters themselves. You wouldn't dream of countering Heracross with Claydol, for example. At best, you'd pivot around it while switch stalling for sand damage. The added power of coverage meant that fighters were setting into that role we'd come to recognize them for. Neutral targets weren't safe with the exception of the most out-and-out physically bulkiest Pokemon, like defensive Metagross, and resists weren't necessarily safe either, whether for coverage or sheer power. It was mostly the former in the bulkier Advance, where the fighting resists were generally on the tankier side. Even offensively minded ones like Gyarados thanks to Intimidate, but there were some instances of crazy power where even the resist of a Zapdos wasn't necessarily enough to withstand some of the absurd strain being dished out by Medicham, Machamp, or Heracross. This crazy power stemmed from the slew of new additions. Yes, new fighting types had been added in Breloom, Medicham, and Blaziken, but they were frightening to deal with precisely because they could unleash this massive new damage. Choice Band was not fighting specific, but it was a superb new tool for almost every physical attacker. And when combined with the aforementioned Focus Punch, one of the strongest moves in the entire game that fighters uniquely received Stab on, it bombarded opponents with truly absurd damage. Machamp and Heracross could potentially one-hit KO Skarmory with it, while Medicham always did, and additionally could potentially also one-hit KO offensive Zapdos with it through the resist. Not everything had to be so extreme either. Both Focus Punch's potential to fail and Choice Band's move lock, of course, brought with them great risks that fighters could choose to eschew in favor of less immediately explosive but more reliable, maneuverable options. Brick Break was quite consistent as Stab. Its power isn't anywhere near the wall-busting norm we've known for so long, but it certainly got the job done nicely. Breloom and Blaziken had another slightly inaccurate but stronger option in Sky Uppercut, while another boot of Machamp's was its high crit Cross Chop. What if you wanted to boost without Choice Band though? The universal distribution of Bulk Up helped with that, and even assisted in making the fighters more difficult to revenge kill for Pokemon like Dugtrio. Heracross and Breloom could even go further with Swords Dance. Blaziken had it too, but it didn't use it, for it was more focused on its mixed attacking barrage. Indeed, each fighter had unique utility. It wasn't just about raw damage, and for this reason, Heracross was the most common fighter for a long time. The only fighter you'd see in OU, because its main attraction wasn't even its fight stab. It sometimes didn't even use fighting stab of any kind, like on its famed substitute Swords Dance Swarm Selactberry set. Its main claim to fame was its vicious stab Mega Horde, newly backed by Rock Slide's all-important complementary coverage, crucial to just about any offensive fighting type. This is not to say that Heracross didn't regularly unleash brutal fighting type pain though. It was just so good at it specifically because its ferocious bug stab ensured it had a much easier time preventing Celebi, Clado, or Starmie from checking it than the other fighters, which generally had to rely on hidden power, or in Medichamp's case, Shadow Ball, which were both far less spammable and less destructive against these targets. We already mentioned Heracross's Choice Band Focus Punch as a particularly devastating attack, but it didn't need the Choice Band for it to sting, and its Brick Break was quite fierce, especially with Swords Dance. During the era where it was common for Skarmory to run Spikes, Whirlwind, Protect, and Toxic, aka no Drill Peck in sight, Heracross would run both Swords Dance and Focus Punch to completely obliterate it. Furthermore, it wasn't just Heracross's secondary stab that made it such a potent attacker. Another one of its major advantages over the other fighters was its speed. The other fighters, scary as they could be, all suffer from relatively middling speed. It generally didn't hold them back from getting their jobs done too much once players had figured out how to use their strengths, but it sure was used against them. This is not to say that Heracross was a speedster, but it was the fastest of the fighters by some margin. Its presence in the tier demanded the standard of a 270 speed stat on Salamence, among others, to outrun its Adamant sets, something which Heracross could occasionally prey on by running a Jolly Nature instead, something that also put it ahead of the standard modest Moltres. But that still wasn't all. Heracross's deceptively solid special bulk meant it could stomach a stab psychic without much difficulty, and it took neutral water moves quite well. This was complemented by its nice base speed, meaning it often didn't have to fully invest and could instead bulk itself out some. Now, while the fighting type was solely synonymous with Heracross and high-level advance, for some time the others quickly established their unique traits as sufficiently valuable to leave metagame-defining impact. The sheer strength of Medichamp's previously alluded to was awesome in the literal sense, and it didn't even have to rely on a hidden power to strike ghosts and psychics. Breloom's Spore consistently demonstrated the brutal power of sleep and sent a wave of Lum Berries rippling through the metagame. Its Mach Punch was also superb for checking Dragon Dance Tyranitar and having a weapon against Dugtrio. Blaziken's Fire Stab meant it immediately threatened Skarmory and Metagross in a way the other fighters couldn't hope to achieve, and was renowned for being an excellent Skarm Bliss buster. Machamp's Crit Happy Cross Chop, in addition to its massive power, made it similar to Medicham for pure fighting spam power, except it had the major advantage of its Guts ability, meaning it did not fear Gengar's Will-O-Wisp whatsoever. Finally, Hariyama was similar with its access to Guts, but also had a massive HP stat that let it shrug off Blissey's Seismic Toss early. It could also slot Knockoff in and ruin whatever had switching into it on its mind. Thick Fat was another option for its ability. With this, its huge HP and utility capacity of Knockoff, Hariyama was the one defensive fighter in Advanced OU. A last note, interestingly, while these fighters made do with their various stabs, Gen 3 was also the generation that introduced Superpower, whose 120 base power was much more indicative of the direction the fighting type would go in and become known for. However, Superpower was only given to a few Pokemon, none of them fighting type. The only Superpower packing pokes in Gen 3 were Deoxys, the Reggie Trio, and Nidoqueen. We've examined fighters generally thus far so as to examine the progression from their meager origins to anti-metagame threat. Fighters would no longer go against the grain starting in Generation 4 though. We have delineated DPP onwards because this is not only the origin point of their eruption into one of the most defining phases of competitive play, but because the way they begin to play here is so similar to how we can come to see them as a whole. They are highly spammable, partly because they are now so often circumventing the previous issue of their speed, whether through new fighters being faster and or the addition of Choice Scarf, and partly because they now nearly universally receive an incredible stab move they can rip through so much of the metagame with: Close Combat. This move almost single-handedly propelled the fighting type to become the force they still are today, and its very style is definitive. Superb 120 base power, perfect accuracy, and the only drawback is the drop of both defenses. This illustrates the fighter. Forget the balance of Brick Break. No, now we will drop our defenses in favor of all-out offense. CC defined things right off the bat in Diamond and Pearl, way before Platinum. Heracross wielded new stab with Choice Scarf and the secondary stab on par with its legendary Mega Horn. In fact, because of its far superior coverage, Close Combat was now its primary stab, not like the Mega Horn supporting near afterthought that Heracross's fighting coverage had been in the previous generation. Of course, returning stars Machamp and Breloom did not pack Close Combat. Well, Machamp got it, but it was too busy wielding its infamous no-guard dynamic punch to devil devilish effect. Breloom made do with the less spammable but equally powerful superpower. It didn't mind too much because it was so enjoying the physical special split, now allowing it to use physical grass stab. However, there were two new fighters in town, Lucario and Infernape. They defined the new breed of fighting type, which remains the standard of the playstyle to this day. Fast and spam in close combat. Now, Lucario wasn't blazing fast, but for a fighting type, it certainly was, at base 90. It was faster than any other fighting type up until that point, and in addition to being especially fast for a fighter, it had a perfectly solid speed stat, full stop. With this in mind, we can now see how revolutionary Infernape was, demonstrating the importance of speed, which made it much better than Blaziken, despite not being as powerful. At base 108, it wasn't just the fastest fighter by a country mile, but it was one of the fastest overall Pokemon in OU, its speed being a major defining part of the tier and indicating the future direction of fighters. They weren't just going to blast through you with sheer strength, they were going to outrun you while doing it. Of course, Infernape was also unique in that it was a fighter that often attacked on the special side, though of course not with its fighting stat. Even its mixed sets ran close combat. It helped that Pursuit was now physical, with Tyranitar's newfound special defense boost under sand, making it even more efficient at trapping. And just when you think that made it easy to slap on the support fighters needed, consider the rock coverage that had always been a crucial complement for fighting stab, and then that they now receive even more of this through the new mandatory hazard Stealth Rock. It made it incredibly easy to punish anti-fighter Pokemon, switch into Ghost or Psychic and get pursued, switch into Flying type and get 25% of your health ripped off. There are flying types neutral to Stealth Rock, you say? Very true, and the most common is Skarmory, which doesn't actually resist fighting. The other, Gliscor, maintains its fighting resistance, but it also has an incredibly exploitable quadruple weakness to Ice Punch. Indeed, the physical special split also made it possible for many fighters to employ this move for similarly effective synergistic ice coverage, as opposed to the aforementioned Rock. Of course, Gen 4 also boosted this Rock coverage, letting players go from Rock Slide to Stone Edge. As for fighting's fourth resist, Bug, well, OU's defining bugs, Scizor and Fortress didn't resist fighting. Heracross did, but its paltry physical bulk meant it wasn't switching into its fellow fighters well at all, in spite of a brief period where players desperate for Breloom answers used a Sleep Talk Guts choice band set. Of course, each of these fighters had unique tools, but stab close combat was now the new norm. Not everywhere, not just OU. It wasn't required, of course. In addition to Breloom and Machamp in OU, Toxicroak was excellent in UU and Medicham in NU, the latter enjoying high jump kicks boost to 100 base power, but close combat became synonymous with the fighting type as a whole. Its defining effect was visible everywhere. Lucario continued its rampages and Ubers, while the sub-OU tiers witnessed varying shades of Hariyama, the Hitmontrio, Primeape, and newcomer Gallade, all spamming the move to superb effect. Gallade so much so that it actually got banned from UU, as did Heracross after briefly dipping into the tier at the generation's end, and at that time, Generation 5 came around, taking the Gen 4 fighting and upping it to levels so insane that these monsters were easily on par with the dragons and weather abusers that dominated and defined the gen. Some players remarked it was as if among all the chaos already present, Game Freak had gone out of their way to make sure there were also plenty of new fighters. Infernape's base 108 speed tier, previously almost sacrosanct, was now rendered commonplace by the Swords of Justice. Of these, Cobalion not being an OU Pokemon, rather than suggestive of its flaws, more illustrated the incredible rate of progress, where a base 108 speed fighting type now fit perfectly fine in UU. Right behind it was the base 105 Mienshao, which was OU. Also rocking OU were newcomers Scrafty, Virizion, and Conkeldurr, but king among them was the new close combat spammer, Terrakion, packing Infernape speed and downright vicious power. As fast as 8 was, its power, while certainly excellent, banded close combats were quite threatening, wasn't nearly as stunning as Terrakion's, which dropped neutral targets much more easily. Plus, you know that rock coverage fighters like so much? That was Terrakion's second stab. And it wasn't like there weren't good fighting answers either. Gliscor gaining Poison Heal made it truly elite. Slowbro gaining Regenerator was massive, Uniclus was dominant, but in spite of them, Terrakion and its CC, especially Choice Banded, shredded the metagame as much as it defined it, with many even considering it broken at the end of Black and White 1. Non-close combat users were better off than ever, too. On account of other major fighting buffs, Drain Punch's increase in power and PP made it a staple on Toxicroak, newly OU by virtue of its rain abuse, as well as bulky bulky variants of the returning Breloom and the aforementioned newcomer Conkeldurr. This gave the bulky fighting playstyle new life, and on the other side was a move even more extreme than close combat, wielded by Mienshao, Scrafty, and a newly speed-boosting Blaziken en route to becoming the first fighting type banned from OU was a massively buffed high jump kick, whose risk of enormous recoil damage was well worth its monstrous leap to a CC eclipsing 130 base power, which potentially ascends to even higher heights with Mienshao's, and in RU, Hitmonlee's reckless ability. Blaziken's ban didn't mean fighters even went down in number either. It was simply replaced by Infernape, and that was just Black and White 1. Come Black and White 2, you could forget most of these. No, not because of everyone's new fighting resist and Landorus Styrian, but because fighting types rose to a new standard with OU dominated by Breloom, which had newly gained Technician and thus Mach Punches on par with Scizor's famous Bullet Punch, and especially one of the new faces of the tier, the final Sword of Justice, Keldeo, unique among fighters in that it was a special attacker, unless you played Ubers, which had an uncontained Arceus fighting and its judgment unleashed upon it in Black and White as well, though Keldeo's signature Secret Sword, of course, hit the physical defense stat, ensuring preeminent Special Walls Chansey and Blissey were completely destroyed by it. It joined Terrakion in that category of Infernape level speed, combined with incredible power and secondary stab. In fact, Keldeo led the fighting type into another generation of continued dominance in the 6. This particularly illustrates the power of fighters because even the introduction of a new resist in the Fairy type didn't much slow them down. Recall the issues of previous fighting resist, destroyed by Stealth Rock or Pursuit basically, and notice how Fairy is both neutral to Stealth Rock and actually resists Pursuit. Not only that, it's neutral to the Rock and Ice covers that fighters so commonly use, and yet Breloom and Terrakion were once again serious threats, especially Breloom, and Keldeo wound up being one of the best, most spammed Pokemon in the game, even though Azumarill newly resisted both its stabs. In a similar vein, this didn't stop Blaziken from being banned once again without even needing the help from its new Mega form. Speaking of, fighting Megas were shockingly among the scariest around. We're not just talking about Mega Lucario and how it took the fast, strong fighting thing way over the top with speed faster than Thundurus, let alone the Latios that had previously been a fighting deterrent, as well as the absurd power of its newly gained adaptability. We're talking Mega Medicham and Heracross, which in the wake of the ban of the also busted Aegislash, became among the most frightening, defining OU wall breakers. Mega Medicham's power was stunning, yes, but it was that power combined with the newfound base 100 speed that really made it so scary. Meanwhile, Mega Heracross actually slowed down, but it also bulked out, making it more difficult to revenge kill, and thanks to its anti-psychic bug stab, it was well and truly unwallable. Even Mega Medicham wouldn't be able to get past the likes of Mew or Reuniclus. Then came Oraz, and non-choice Scarf fighting type speed went to another level with the addition of Mega Lopunny, whose incredible base 135 was paired with a stab high jump kick that even Ghost couldn't block thanks to Scrappy. Oraz' fighting Megas were usually Lopunny for its incredible speed or Medicham for its outright destruction, but Heracross certainly had its place for the Swords Dance precision of its unwallability. This dynamic continued into Gen 7. There, the increase of Fairy types and addition of Toxapex meant the old Keldeo-led fighting Vanguard slowed down, but this Mega fighting trio continued to dominate and define the metagame, especially with terrains. They all enjoyed the status protection of Misty Terrain. Mega Medicham's Zen Headbutt was downright disturbing in Psychic Terrain, and Mega Heracross enjoyed underrated support from Grassy Terrain that not only reinforces bulk through recovery, but also enabled the most from its skill link boosted Bullet Seed. Before these Megas took off though, there was a new fighting type that was so monstrous it got itself banned, joining Blaziken and Mega Lucario, Pheromosa, taking the close combat ethos to a new level. No, not that it used close combat. Pheromosa was a high jump kick kind of girl, but more that a CC user is perfectly willing to drop their defenses in favor of that power. Pheromosa had no defenses to speak of, and instead went all out insane in both power and speed. It was the terrifying fighter, and no feasible attempts to find checks for it like Alolan Marowak could deny its might. It simply had to be accepted with a ban. So too did Mars Shadow upon the introduction of Ultra Sun and Moon. It was exactly what you would expect from a fast close combat spammer. Ridiculously fast, ridiculously strong, and with perfect tools to ensure fighting resist wouldn't want to come near it. It didn't last a day in OU and proceeded to terrorize Ubers. Beyond the Mega Trio, the terrains also supported the Hawlucha that came into its own in this generation, eating its various seeds to activate its Unburden and turning it into a fast, powerful monster after a Swords Dance, and a respectively bulky one at that. There was also the late discovery of a new close combat user. Komodo was excellent, both offensively as well as that rare guise of the defensive Drain Punch using fighter, in this case one that could take on Heatran, Ash Greninja, and set up Stealth Rock. Offensively, Komodo duo was unique for its variety. It could go mixed just as well as it could go all-out physical on a number of sets, whether it was stealth rocking or dragon dancing, and it had many different excellent Z crystals that it could run through its signature clangorous soul blaze, and its omni boost was the most notable. It didn't even matter that it had both stabs devoured by fairy types. They were often one poison jab away from being nullified, except Magirna, but then that didn't resist close combat. But then Gen 8 came around and Mega Zen Z moves were no more. What would become of the fighters? Given that Blaziken would wind up not just not banned, but in Yu-Yu, one might be forgiven for thinking this indicated a general trend against them, but not quite. Even putting aside the fact that Blaziken, now wielding close combat incidentally, made an excellent comeback as a major OU threat, the spammable fighter was going as strong as ever with the introduction of Urshifu, who terrorized OU in both guises. Rapid Strike wielded Keldeo's famed stab combo alongside U-turn to superb effect, but it was the single strike form that was especially brutal thanks to its perfectly complementary secondary dark stab. The auto crit Wicked Blow that blew past Landorus Intimidate with power just as fierce as close combat, leading to single strike's eventual ban. You didn't want to switch any CC resist into it because of how badly it destroyed all of them, except another fighter, Buzzswole, which fulfilled the bulky fighter role even after Urshifu's ban. It wasn't just a tank either. The choice band set proved itself to be as mighty a close combat spammer as anything. It actually outmatched Urshifu power-wise. Buzzswole's cousin Pheromosa was banned again as well, and that still wasn't all OU had to offer. Galarian Zapdos' choice band set was utterly ferocious. If it caught a Defiant boost, it unleashed the scariest close combats available, making mincemeat even out of a resist as tanky as bold Toxapex. And of course, Defiant meant Landorus T's Intimidate would only make it stronger, making its close combat the most theoretically perfect of all. All of this has been leading us to Gen 9, where overwrought fight spam has reached its zenith. Right off the bat, the warping, defining Great Tusk is both offensively and defensively amazing, while packing seriously good speed even before the possibility of photosynthesis speed boosting, and in fact being so good defensively further fuels its potential to unleash close combat. Iron Valiant takes this further. It's no great shakes defensively, but it's so brutal on both sides of the spectrum, not just fast and strong, but with a tremendous spam ability to its onslaughts. As to be a consistent source of controversy, Zamazenta wound up dropping from Ubers and combined insane speed with bulky fighting tactics, both in tanking ability and use of body press. Its all-out sets with close combats are solid too, of course, though its attack is positively polite by modern standards. At the time of this video, it is neck and neck with King Gambit, which it often counters as the best Pokemon in the tier. Plus in Sneasler and its incredible toolkit, including what else? Superb attack and speed supporting close combat, especially once it activated Unburdened. You had another in the growing line of fighting types that were just too much for OU. We've gone from no fighters and Ubers to seeing them banned in every Gen 5 and onward. And if you glance at the actual Uber tier, it's just as crazy there. Koraidon is basically Mega Komo-o that is also a Groudon. What will they think of next, we wonder, as we summarize our findings through observing that fighters have become increasingly outlandish, most notably in the raw power and speed that lets them brandish their vicious stabs so effectively. Though there are some excellent, slower, bulkier examples as well, and on top of that, these strong, fast fighters have increasingly better, wilder tools to assist them in case raw power isn't enough. They have gone from the lowest of the low to regularly defining OU in many cases, and in many cases getting banned. The only question is, should Game Freak push them even further? Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about the fighting types evolution? Should they be nerfed? Should they be buffed? Whatever it is, let us know in the comments. Also, thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Dr. Mint, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Nurse Jake, Jack G, Lord of the Rabbit, Pretzel SP, Ray Ray, Skylaria, Soares and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, and Quetzalcoatl Northropi for their major support of our videos. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.